had seen war before. In her 40 years as a correspondent for the Galactic Press Collective, she had documented conflicts across 17 star systems. She had watched them execute their precise territorial adjustments, pulling back the moment calculations showed diminishing returns. She had recorded as they absorbed 3 colonies through methodical pressure campaigns that never required a single shot. War, as the galaxy understood it, was mathematics. One side calculated advantage, the other calculated loss, and when the numbers became clear, the matter ended. Nothing in her experience prepared her for Earth. She arrived during what the humans called a civil conflict, though she struggled to understand what made it civil. The fighting had consumed a nation for 3 years. Cities lay in ruins. Millions had fled their homes. The death toll climbed higher each day, and neither side showed any sign of stopping. Her editors had sent her to document what they assumed would be a quick study in primitive warfare, a species that had not yet achieved interstellar travel, destroying itself over resources or territory. The story would serve as a cautionary tale for developing worlds. Embedded with a human military unit on her first day, standard procedure for any correspondent, the soldiers seemed surprised to see her, and being nearly 7 feet tall with compound eyes and clicking mandibles, but they accepted her presence with remarkable ease. One of them, a young woman named Sergeant Tors, simply shrugged and said they could use all the help they could get. She did not ask what kind of help an alien journalist might provide. The first engagement came that night. Enemy forces had taken positions in a residential district, expected the humans to establish a perimeter and begin the careful process of forcing withdrawal through superior positioning. Instead, Tors led her squad directly into the burning streets. Artillery shells screamed overhead. Bullets cracked against walls and pavement. The noise alone would have sent most galactic species into shock paralysis. The humans ran toward it. Followed at a distance, her recording devices capturing everything. She watched Tors kick open a door and pull an elderly human from a collapsing building. She watched 2 soldiers carry a wounded civilian through crossfire while they provided cover. She watched a medic stop in the middle of an active firefight to treat a child's burns before passing the boy to his screaming mother and returning to the battle. None of this made sense. The tactical disadvantage of such actions was obvious. Every second spent on rescue operations increased the soldiers' exposure to enemy fire. Every resource devoted to civilian protection reduced combat effectiveness. The calculations were simple. These humans were losing the engagement because they kept stopping to save people who provided no strategic value. And yet they kept doing it. The fighting lasted 3 hours. When it ended, Tors sat against a destroyed vehicle and drank water from a canteen. Her uniform was torn and bloody. One of her soldiers had died. 2 more had taken serious wounds. But she had personally carried 4 civilians to safety, and her squad had established a protected evacuation route that saved at least 30 more. Approached carefully, she had questions that demanded answers. Tors looked up at her with eyes that held exhaustion and something else, something the correspondent could not immediately identify. The sergeant asked if was getting good footage. The alien confirmed that she was, and then asked why Tors had risked her life and her soldiers' lives for civilians who had no connection to her. The tactical cost seemed to outweigh any possible benefit. Tors was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that some things mattered more than tactics. She said that if they stopped trying to protect people, they would forget why they were fighting in the first place. She said that the day she walked past someone who needed help would be the day she stopped being the person she wanted to be. Did not understand, but she recorded the response. Her first dispatch reached the collective's distribution network the following morning. She had intended it as preliminary footage, a simple documentation of ground conditions. She expected moderate interest from military analysts and departments, perhaps a few thousand viewers across the major worlds. Within 1 hour, 15 billion beings had accessed the broadcast. The collective's servers crashed twice under the traffic load. Worlds that had never shown interest in external conflicts suddenly demanded more coverage. Discussion forums across the galaxy erupted with debate. What kind of species behaved this way? What possible evolutionary advantage could such behavior provide? Were the humans insane, or was there something the rest of the galaxy had failed to understand? Received orders to continue embedding. Her editors sent reinforcements. Within 2 weeks, a team of 12 correspondents from different species had arrived on Earth. They spread across the conflict, embedding with various human factions on all sides of the fighting. Each returned with stories that comprehension. A correspondent from the geometric mines of watched a human commander weep over his fallen soldiers, then stand up 10 minutes later and lead another assault with total conviction. The correspondent could not reconcile the emotional breakdown with the subsequent display of determination. His species processed loss through compartmentalization, sealing grief away to maintain function. The human seemed to carry his grief openly while somehow fighting harder because of it. A correspondent from the hive world of documented enemy soldiers sharing medical supplies with each other during a temporary ceasefire. Two forces that had been trying to kill each other hours earlier now worked together to keep wounded fighters alive. When the ceasefire ended, they returned to combat. The correspondent's collective mind struggled to process the contradiction. A correspondent from the peaceful herbivore species found herself unable to transmit her footage for 3 days. She had witnessed human soldiers laughing and singing together in a moment of rest, their joy so pure and genuine that it seemed impossible in the context of the surrounding destruction. She had also witnessed what those same soldiers did when the fighting resumed. The contrast broke something in her understanding of the universe. Gathered reports from all her colleagues. She spent long nights reviewing footage, searching for patterns, trying to construct a coherent picture of human warfare. The contradictions mounted instead of resolving. Humans committed acts of horrific cruelty. She documented massacres, torture, deliberate attacks on civilian populations. She watched soldiers lose themselves in rage and hatred, becoming something that no longer resembled the beings who had told her about their families and their homes. And then she watched those same species perform acts of breathtaking mercy. She watched enemies carry each other to safety. She watched soldiers sacrifice themselves for strangers. She watched beings who had lost everything find reasons to keep fighting, not for victory, but for the possibility that things might someday be better. The humans seemed capable of being both the worst and the best creatures in the galaxy, sometimes in the same hour, sometimes in the same individual. They contained multitudes that no other species seemed to possess. Their wars were not mathematics. Their wars were something else entirely. Struggled to find the right word for her reports. Tragedy came close. Drama came closer, but neither captured the essential quality that made human conflicts so compelling. Finally, she settled on the human term itself, story. Human warfare was not calculation. It was story. It had heroes and villains, triumphs and disasters, moments of transcendence and depths of despair. Every soldier became a character. Every battle became a chapter. Every death meant something to someone. The galaxy had never seen anything like it. And as her dispatches continued to reach farther and attract more attention, began to sense that something fundamental was shifting in the beings who watched them. Something in the way they understood themselves and their place in the universe. The humans were not just fighting a war. They were teaching the galaxy what war could mean. The broadcasts from Earth continued for months, stayed embedded with Sergeant Tors and her unit through urban combat, through rural operations, through terrible defeats and hard-won victories. She documented everything. She asked questions that the soldiers could not always answer. She watched humans die for causes they could barely articulate, following flags and ideals and bonds of loyalty that seemed to exist outside rational explanation. Other species fought for territory, for resources, for survival. Humans fought for those things too, But they also fought for abstractions, for freedom, for justice, for the idea that their sacrifice might make the world better for people they would never meet. The galaxy had seen billions of conflicts across its long history. It had never seen anything like this. The collective's viewership continued to grow. Worlds that had considered themselves beyond such primitive behavior found themselves watching every dispatch with rapt attention. And slowly, in ways that no one could yet predict, the stories began to change them. The human war raged on. Sergeant Tors and her soldiers kept fighting, kept saving civilians, kept dying for things that mattered to them. And across the stars, billions of beings watched and wondered what it would feel like to care about something that much. Did not know where this was leading. She only knew that she could not stop watching either. The correspondents had come to document a primitive conflict. Instead, they had discovered something that would shake the foundations of galactic civilization. Human stories, it turned out, were contagious. And the infection was only beginning. The effects of the Earth broadcasts became impossible to ignore within the first year. Notice small changes first. Messages from her mentioned her work with an enthusiasm that seemed unusual. Her species, the Mar, valued emotional restraint and measured assessment. They did not typically use words like inspiring or moving to describe journalistic content, yet those words appeared more and more frequently in the communications she received. Her editors reported similar patterns across every world receiving the broadcasts. Viewership continued to climb. Discussion forums. Academic institutions launched new research programs focused on human psychology, but the changes went deeper than mere interest. The world of had abolished military forces 3 centuries earlier. Their species had evolved as herbivores on a planet without large predators, and they had never developed the capacity for organized violence. Their philosophers considered this lack a mark of advanced civilization. War was something primitive species engaged in before achieving true enlightenment. 6 months after the first Earth broadcasts reached, their planetary council convened an emergency session. Citizens had begun asking questions that no one had asked in generations. What if there were threats that could not be answered with diplomacy? What if protecting innocence sometimes required force? What if the understanding of peace was not wisdom, but merely the absence of challenge? The debates consumed their society for months. Some argued that the human influence was corrupting their peaceful nature. Others suggested that perhaps their nature had never been truly tested. The broadcasts from Earth showed soldiers dying to protect strangers, bleeding to uphold principles, sacrificing everything for people who would never know their names. They had always considered such behavior primitive. Now some of them wondered if it might be something else. They did not rebuild their military, but they began training volunteer emergency response teams. They established protocols for evacuating civilians in the event of natural disasters. They discussed, for the first time in centuries, what they might do if their peaceful existence ever came under threat. Small changes, significant ones. The hive minds of collective experienced something even more profound. Their species operated through pure consensus, millions of individual organisms linked into vast networks of shared consciousness. Conflict resolution happened automatically through the integration of all perspectives into optimal solutions. The concept of individual sacrifice made no sense within their framework. No single organism held enough importance to justify its loss for collective benefit, when the collective itself could simply adapt around any problem. The broadcasts from Earth broke something in their understanding. They watched individual humans choose death for principles that could not be calculated. They saw soldiers protect squad members at the cost of their own lives, an exchange that produced net negative results by any rational measure. They observed humans finding meaning in sacrifice itself, treating the act of giving as valuable independent of what it achieved. The collective minds began generating new concepts to accommodate these observations. Individual significance, chosen sacrifice, meaning beyond optimization. For a species that had operated on pure utilitarian consensus these ideas felt revolutionary. Some collectives rejected them entirely. Others began experimenting with previously unimaginable structures that allowed individual components greater autonomy. Schisms formed where none had existed before. They were changing, and they were not certain whether to embrace or resist the transformation. The Galactic Council took notice, received a summons to testify before the Council's Committee on Cultural Stability. She traveled to the Council Station, a massive structure at the gravitational center of civilized space, and found herself seated before representatives of the galaxy's most powerful species. The committee chair, a massive crystalline being from the elder world asked her directly. Her broadcasts were destabilizing societies that had achieved equilibrium centuries ago. What exactly was she showing them? Presented her findings carefully. She explained that human conflict coverage was unusual in several respects. Other species fought wars, sometimes brutal ones, but they treated warfare as problems to be solved. Calculate advantage, apply force, resolve dispute, move on. Humans approached their conflicts differently. They created narratives. They identified heroes and villains. They assigned meaning to events that other species would process as simple data points. The representative from interrupted. She asked what was wrong with assigning meaning. Her people had watched the broadcasts, and many found themselves moved by what they saw. Was there danger in being moved? Answered honestly. She did not know. She only documented what she observed, but the effects were undeniable. Worlds across the galaxy were questioning assumptions they had held for generations. The human broadcasts were not just entertainment. They were changing the way other species understood themselves. The committee debated for 3 days. Some members advocated suppression. The broadcasts could be restricted to academic channels, limiting public access. The cultural contamination could be contained before it spread further. Others pointed out practical difficulties. The correspondents had become celebrities. Trillions of beings awaited each new dispatch. Attempting censorship would only amplify interest in the forbidden content. The galaxy had become addicted to human stories. There was no closing that door. The council reached a compromise. The broadcasts would continue, but expanded academic study would accompany them. Researchers would analyze the psychological effects on viewing populations. Early warning systems would monitor for dangerous social instabilities. The situation would be managed rather than suppressed. Returned to Earth, and she noticed that her broadcasts had changed. Previously, she had focused on combat footage and soldier interviews. Now she spent more time on the stories behind the fighting, the families waiting at home, the letters soldiers wrote to loved ones they might never see again, the small moments of humanity that survived even in the midst of horror. These segments drew even higher viewership than the combat footage. Beings across the galaxy seemed hungry for the emotional content, for the connections and the losses and the hopes that drove humans to do what they did. They wanted to understand not just how humans fought, but why. And as documented those reasons, she began to sense something shifting in the way the galaxy understood its own existence. They were not the only world reconsidering their relationship with conflict. The pacifist collective had watched human medics treating enemy wounded under fire and begun asking whether compassion and violence could truly coexist. The warrior castes had observed human soldiers crying over fallen enemies and wondered whether honor required the complete destruction of opponents or might permit mercy instead. The dying cultures of the Outer Rim watched human civilizations survive catastrophic conflicts and somehow emerge stronger, finding hope where they had assumed only decline was possible. Human wars were teaching the galaxy new ways to think about itself. The changes came slowly. A debate here, a policy shift there, a philosophical school emerging around concepts that had never before been articulated. But they accumulated. and somewhere, in ways that no one could yet foresee, they were building towards something larger. Finished her testimony with a warning she was not certain the council understood. Human stories were not just entertainment. They were not just cultural artifacts. They were something more dangerous. Human stories were contagious. They spread from mind to mind, changing everyone they touched. And now they had spread across the galaxy. Whatever came next, the universe would never be the same. The correspondence kept broadcasting. The galaxy kept watching. And the changes kept accumulating, invisible threads weaving together into a pattern that would not become clear until it was far too late to stop. The invasion began on a world called Seven, a small colony that had never warranted galactic attention. The hegemony arrived with 40 warships and a simple demand: surrender or face destruction. Seven possessed no military capability worth mentioning. Their population numbered less than 2 million. The calculation was obvious. They refused. Learned about the invasion through routine monitoring channels. Her editors initially showed no interest. The hegemony had conquered 42 civilizations over the past century, always following the same pattern: overwhelming force, rational calculation by the target, peaceful absorption, minimal casualties. The process was efficient and unremarkable, not worth correspondent resources. But something different was happening at Seven. The colony had no formal military, but its citizens were organizing resistance. They were building barricades, manufacturing improvised weapons, establishing communication networks for coordinated defense. None of this made strategic sense. The hegemony forces could annihilate the entire colony from orbit if they chose. Resistance would only delay the inevitable while dramatically increasing the final death toll. Requested authorization to cover the situation. Her editors hesitated, uncertain whether the story warranted the expense. Then they reviewed the demographic data from Seven and noticed something interesting. The colony had some of the highest viewership rates for Earth broadcasts in the entire sector. Arrived 3 days before the ground assault began, she found a world transformed by human stories. The colonists spoke in phrases borrowed from Earth conflicts. They quoted human poets and philosophers. They had organized their defense structure around principles learned from watching human soldiers protect civilians under fire. Their leader, a middle-aged farmer named Orr, told her directly that his people had learned something from the broadcasts. They had learned that some things were worth dying for. The hegemony expected surrender. They had never encountered anything else. When their ground forces landed and met armed resistance, their commanders experienced something approaching confusion. This was not how conquest worked. This was not how rational beings behaved. The colonists died in large numbers. They were outmatched in every measurable way, but they kept fighting. They established defensive positions and held them far longer than tactical analysis suggested possible. They rescued wounded from exposed positions under heavy fire, just as they had watched human soldiers do in the broadcasts. They treated captured hegemony soldiers with surprising dignity, following protocols they had learned from Earth's rules of warfare. And they transmitted everything to the galactic networks. Documented the battle in real-time broadcasts that drew viewership numbers exceeding anything in collective history. Trillions of beings watched Seven's desperate defense, watched civilians transform into soldiers, watched a species that should have surrendered choose to fight instead. The effects rippled outward faster than anyone anticipated. On the emergency response teams that had been formed months earlier suddenly had volunteers requesting actual combat training. On the collective worlds, individual organisms began separating from their networks to form independent units capable of physical action. On a dozen other worlds, beings who had never contemplated violence started asking what they would do if the hegemony came for them. And then came the coalition. It formed spontaneously, without central coordination. Ships began arriving at Seven from worlds across the sector. Some came from species that had never engaged in military action. Others came from former enemies who had fought each other for generations. They had nothing in common except the broadcasts they had watched and the conviction that what was happening at Seven mattered. The hegemony had not prepared for this. Their strategic models did not account for irrational interference from uninvolved parties. When the first coalition ships engaged their fleet, they responded with standard tactical adjustments. When more ships arrived, they called for reinforcements. When reinforcements proved insufficient, they experienced something their species had not felt in centuries. They experienced fear. Watch the coalition forces coordinate their attacks through improvised communication channels. They had no unified command structure, no shared military doctrine, no history of cooperation. But they had watched the same broadcasts. They had learned the same lessons. And somehow, impossibly, they made it work. She documented a pilot sacrificing their ship to protect a damaged vessel. She recorded warriors from the dying culture of singing human songs as they charged hegemony positions. She watched beings from 17 different species fight together under a banner bearing words from a human conflict centuries old. The words translated roughly as, "We shall never surrender." The hegemony from Seven after 12 days of fighting. It was the first time in their history that they had failed to complete a conquest. Their commanders returned home to face difficult questions from their leadership. Their population began watching the broadcasts from the battle, seeing for the first time how the galaxy perceived them. Some of them started asking whether conquest was truly the highest aspiration of their civilization. The coalition forces celebrated their victory with traditions borrowed from every participating species and from the human broadcasts that had united them. They sang songs in languages none of them spoke. They shared rituals that meant nothing in their original cultural contexts. They had become something new, forged in battle from fragments of human inspiration. Filed her final dispatch from the observation deck of a coalition flagship. Behind her, soldiers from 11 species were teaching each other their world's victory traditions alongside borrowed human ones. A medic was treating wounds on a warrior. An individual, separated from its collective for the first time in its existence, was learning to drink celebratory beverages with new friends. She reflected on everything she had witnessed over the years. Her people had come to Earth to document primitive warfare, expecting to record cautionary tales of species destroying themselves through violence. Instead, they had discovered something far more dangerous. Human stories were not just entertainment. They were not just cultural artifacts. They were weapons. Not weapons that killed, but weapons that changed. They transformed the beings who consumed them, reshaping their understanding of themselves and their place in the universe. The galaxy had watched humans fight for things that mattered. The galaxy had learned that some causes were worth dying for. The galaxy had absorbed the idea that individual sacrifice could hold meaning beyond calculation. And now the galaxy was different. Did not know whether the changes were good or bad. The coalition that had saved Seven might become the foundation for lasting peace among its member species, or it might fracture into new conflicts, species who had learned violence from human broadcasts turning that violence against each other. The future remained unwritten. But she knew that nothing would ever be the same. The hegemony's power had been broken not by superior firepower, but by an idea. The idea that resistance could matter. The idea that standing together was preferable to surrendering alone. The idea that stories could inspire actions that calculation would never support. Humans had not taught the universe to fight. Many species had known warfare long before Earth's broadcasts reached them, but humans had taught the universe something else. They had taught it to believe that fighting could mean something. They had taught it to find glory in sacrifice, purpose in struggle, meaning in the face of death. They had taught it to tell stories about itself. And those stories passed from world to world, species to species, mind to mind, had changed everything. ended her broadcast with a simple observation. She said that her people had come to Earth expecting to document the death of a primitive civilization. Instead, they had witnessed the birth of something new. The galaxy would remember this moment. The galaxy would tell stories about it for generations to come. And those stories, she suspected, would change the future in ways that no one could yet predict. The broadcast ended. The celebration continued. Somewhere in the distance, ships from a dozen worlds prepared to return home, carrying with them experiences that would reshape their civilizations. And across the galaxy, billions of beings who had watched the battle turned to each other and began to talk about what they had seen, about what it meant, about what they might do if they ever faced similar choices. Human stories had spread across the stars. Human values had taken root in alien soil. Human dreams of meaning and purpose and sacrifice had infected minds that had never before conceived such concepts. The correspondents had come to document humanity. Instead, they had helped humanity change the universe. It was, reflected, the best story she had ever told.